at the Q&A Zach Bennett, who is the CEO and Chief Architect for Visual Enterprise Architecture. And with him, we'll have Jason Robke, who is a senior leader with the Alliances Development at the Association for Supply Chain Management. So without further ado, they will introduce themselves with the presentation they will share with you today on how they are driving supply chain transformation success with SCOR DS for SAP Signavio. So you should be seeing the video come up to you momentarily.
Hello and welcome to today's presentation on driving your supply chain transformation success with the SCOR DS Accelerator for SAP Signavio. This is presented via a strategic technology partnership between Visual Enterprise Architecture and the Association for Supply Chain Management. ASCM delivers the SCOR Digital Standard, the #1 global standard for supply chain excellence. Our speakers today include myself, Zach Bennett, the CEO and Chief Architect for Visual Enterprise Architecture, along with Jason Robke, the Senior Manager for Alliances and Development at ASCM. For today, our agenda will begin with an overview of the SCOR Digital Standard and their vision for 2030. We'll talk a little bit about driving supply chain transformation, followed by a demonstration of the SCOR DS Accelerator delivered on the platform for SAP Signavio by Visual Enterprise Architecture. Visual Enterprise Architecture is a strategic services and solution company focusing on business process excellence. We like to view the market around business process modeling, process governance, process mining, and process automation. We've been in business for more than 26 years. And our team of consultants have delivered solutions for companies across all different industries and of all different sizes. We really focus on accelerating your transformation with business process excellence. And now I'd like to hand it over to Jason Robke, who will talk a little bit more about ASCM, the Association for Supply Chain Management. Jason, over to you.
Thanks, Zach. So as Zach mentioned, my name is Jason Robke, Senior Manager Alliances Development here at ASCM. I'm responsible for managing and growing our partner network in North America, Europe, as well as New Zealand. Prior to this, I worked for Boeing, and a large part of my job at Boeing was utilizing the SCOR model to drive supply chain transformation within the organization. So I'm intimately familiar not only with the SCOR model itself, but also the application of it to improve an organization's supply chain, really drive that end-to-end supply chain transformation. So very excited to be here today and share with you a little bit more about ASCM, but also dive into the updated SCOR DS model that can be utilized for your organization's supply chain improvement journey. So I want to start out a little today with a little bit of information on ASCM. For those of you who aren't familiar, ASCM is the largest supply chain professional association globally. We have a global network of partners, instructors, and thought leaders. ASCM is the unbiased partner. We connect organizations around the world to newest thought leadership on all aspects of the supply chain. And the last piece I want to highlight from this is that our world-class standards, with SCOR DS being the most prominent of those, certifications, trainings, and other benchmarks have been leveraged by over 5,000 organizations worldwide, helping them navigate their journey to supply chain excellence. So as we mentioned, the latest update to the SCOR model was released officially worldwide at our annual ASCM Connect conference on September the 18th. This is the largest update to the SCOR model since its inception in the early 2000s, and I just want to take a moment to highlight some of the high-level changes that occurred to the model. So what you're seeing on the screen here is what we refer to as our infinity loop. And for those of you who are familiar with SCOR in the past, you'll notice that this infinity loop is no longer linear like it was prior. This is in recognition of the fact that today's supply chains are no longer linear. They are infinitely in motion, they are constantly changing, and there's the constant need to adapt to the various elements of the supply chain to the customer requirements. So just to highlight a couple of the key changes. So we've added a few level ones to the SCORE model. So just to highlight some of those changes. So number one, for those of you familiar, prior you would see deliver. That has now been split out into order and fulfill to acknowledge the difference between the upfront order management, order acceptance, reservation of inventory processes, and then the back end fulfillment processes, pick, pack, ship, selecting your logistics provider, etc. You'll also notice we switched make to transform. This is an acknowledgement of moving away from make being very centered around a typical production environment, and moving it to a more omni-channel environment that is applicable to industries like services or MRO to specifically call out those non-traditional production line activities. And then the last piece I want to call out then is the orchestrate in the middle. And this is the idea of elevating a layer above the executional aspects of a supply chain, and having a layer that looks at how do we end-to-end within our supply chain, manage that end-to-end, manage the integrations, manage our technology enablement, manage the relationship with other aspects of the business like finance, like our business strategy, etc. So at the end of the day, at a high level, the SCORE update was really all about how do we modernize the model to today's supply chain, and how do we make it easier for today's supply chain professionals to find themselves in the model as they interact with it themselves. So SCORE, for those of you who don't know, SCORE is an acronym that stands for the Supply Chain Operations Reference Model. And the way I like to describe SCORE is like a box of Legos. It gives you the blocks, but it's up to you as an organization to figure out how you want to utilize those blocks to build whatever end product you want. So I like to say that SCORE, the application of SCORE is a little bit of art and a little bit of science. At the end of the day, what SCORE was developed to do is to assist businesses with understanding, structuring, and evaluating their supply chain performance, giving them that industry standard framework that they could utilize so that they have that common vocabulary, that common framework that can be applied to any supply chain, no matter the company, the industry that they are in. The SCORE model describes business activities associated with satisfying a customer's demand. So including at the level one, orchestrate, plan, order, source, transform, fulfill, and return. And one question we get quite a bit is, okay, how do I use the SCORE model? How am I going to use the SCORE DS model to drive improvement? So I want to highlight a couple of use cases for the model. So number one is using that process definition, the process framework, as a way to analyze your current state from a company perspective, and then use that to say, what do we want our future state to look like? How do we close some of the gaps that we identify as we analyze our current state or our as-is company processes? Number two, quantifying operational performance. So this is all around how do we use SCORE's industry standard metrics to say, how do we define the metrics that we want to measure? And secondly, how are we performing against those measures? And how do we then identify root causes for any performance issues that we find? In addition to that, not only being able to see from a company level, we also have tools like the SCOREmark benchmark that allow your company to compare your performance against other companies across the industry or even in other industries via that SCOREmark benchmarking. So you can take a look and see not only how are we performing, but how does that compare against the industry to further identify gaps against your competitors or against others in the industry. At the end of the day, the ultimate use case for the SCORE DS model is it's really all about using it to drive end-to-end supply chain transformation in your organization. So as I mentioned earlier, over 5,000 organizations worldwide have used SCORE DS to improve their organization's supply chain. And what I want to highlight here is SCORE defines a supply chain and that visibility all the way from your suppliers' suppliers to your customers' customers. The important thing I want to highlight here is when you're utilizing the SCORE model, it's important to define what is your organization. What do you want to include within that definition? I say that to say that oftentimes you may see relationships where a supplier or a customer of your organization is actually within your company itself. So one example I like to use in this case is if you define your organization as an internal production line, You could have a fabrication shop that's within another division where that fabrication shop is supplying piece parts to the end production line. So in that case, you have an internal supplier, an intra-company supplier, but that is flushed out by the fact that you define your organization having those tight bounds around what part of the organization do you want to apply the SCOR DS model to. But again, at the end of the day, to summarize, the SCOR DS model wants to define the supply chain from your suppliers all the way to your customer's customer to give that full end-to-end view and allow you to react and respond to changes anywhere along that value chain. So this is one of my favorite slides that I use when we talk about the SCOR DS model, and I really want to highlight that the beauty of the model is the fact that it combines what I call the 4 Ps into one single integrated framework. So those 4 Ps are process, performance, practices, and people or organizational design. So just to go into a little bit more detail around each of those areas. So the first P, process. This is really all around using the model to drive business process transformation. What do I mean by that? So how do you use the model to capture your as-is state from a process perspective, identify the gaps in the current state, and then use that to design what you want your future to-be state from a process perspective. Number 2, the second P, performance. This is all around your metrics. And I think there's 2 key pieces here within the performance section. Number 1 is, what are the calculation of the metric itself, and how are you internally calculating your metrics, and how does it compare to the industry standard definition contained within SCOR? The second piece then is, after you say, am I actually measuring the performance metric correctly, is to then say, okay, how am I performing to that metric? And it's not only performance within your own organization, so how are we performing relative to ourselves, but then also using tools like the SCORmark benchmark to say, how are we comparing against other companies within the industry? The third P, practices. This is all around SCOR for each of the processes having a list of best practices that can be utilized to improve performance in those practices, in those processes. Excuse me. So this is really that. This is really what you can utilize once you say, what's my as-is processes? Where am I seeing some performance defects, root causes of metric performance issues? How do I use some practices that SCOR recommends to close some of those gaps? What are those recommended industry best practices? The third P, or the fourth P, people. I know something that is very much at the top of mind for every supply chain organization. This is around then, what are some of those skills and competencies that I need from my people to enable better practices and improve processes and performance? This also comes with the people perspective, also comes with the list of recommended trainings that can be utilized for your people to upskill or reskill individuals throughout your supply chain organization. The last piece I want to highlight here is just to say, again, the beauty of the SCOR model is all of these 4 aspects are combined into one integrated approach. What I mean by that is no matter where you enter the model, you can make your way to any other area of the Ps. So you could come in to look at a particular process. As an example, you want to say, hey, I want to look at how we do planned supply chain today. You come in, you identify that process, you examine that process, and you'll see a list of metrics that you can use to measure how the performance of the process, as well as best practices and people skills and competencies to improve your performance in that area. I'd like to highlight a few additional changes that were made to the SCOR model as part of the SCOR DS update to the framework. Number 1 is we overhauled source. So a lot of times when we were applying the model in the past, we had individuals who were in procurement or supplier management that looked at source and said, I don't see myself in the model. I'm more on the supply-based identification, strategic sourcing side of things. So we elevated that strategic sourcing to a level 2 within source to make it easier for today's procurement professionals to find themselves in the model. Additionally, I want to highlight that we expanded the SCOR attributes to an area that's very much a focus of the industry today, and that is sustainability. So we added not only sustainability metrics that an organization can use to see how are they achieving against carbon emission goals, water usage, all of the important environmental considerations that are at the forefront of the industry today, but we also added a list of best practices that companies can use to improve their organization's sustainability processes and performance. In addition to those new sustainability metrics and practices, we have also updated the SCORmark benchmark to mirror those new SCOR metrics and give companies the ability to analyze how their company is performing against the industry from a sustainability perspective. The last piece is standards are adopted, they are not self-proclaimed. So as a part of that overall strategy, we wanted to make sure that the SCOR DS model was available to any supply chain practitioner in the world. Therefore, the SCOR DS model is an open access model. It is available via our website, ascm.org, and all the individual needs to do is go to the website, create an ASCM ID, and they'll be able to access all of the content contained within the SCOR DS model. Before I turn it over to Zach to talk a little bit more about using the SCOR DS Accelerator delivered in partnership with VEA, I want to take a little bit deeper dive into the level 2 metrics from a SCOR perspective, because this is really, when you start modeling processes, this is really the meat of the content you need from a process perspective. So a couple of key changes that we made here that I want to highlight. So number one, from an order perspective and fulfillment perspective, we really made the differentiator around what is the type of order that is coming in. Is it a B2C order? Is it a B2B order? Or is it an order that's an intra-company? So the example that I used earlier being an internal fab shop that's providing piece parts to an end manufacturing line. Within source, as I mentioned earlier, we elevated strategic sourcing to really call out the importance of the upfront supply base identification, contracting, all the activities that take place prior to anything being actually delivered from the supplier itself. In addition, we split out source into direct procurement versus indirect procurement, and also elevated source return, which is activities associated with returning product to our supply base. The last piece is within return, we made sure to match our returns to the same type of transform level 2s. So as you'll see, transform being transform product, transform service, and transform MRO. So really making sure that that's applicable to the broader number of companies out there that are more than just a traditional manufacturing environment, and matching that to the type of returns that we'll get back. So in other words, return of product, return of service, or return for reasons of MRO from our end customer. Now I'd like to turn it over to Zach Bennett to go through a little bit more detail around the SCOR DS Accelerator delivered in partnership with VEA. Zach, over to you.
Thanks again, Jason, for that overview of SCOR and the SCOR DS framework. And now I'd like to talk a little bit more about the SCOR DS Accelerator. The primary objective of the Accelerator is to help you drive supply chain transformation using these industry standard frameworks and processes, as well as performance metrics delivered by SCOR DS. There are more than 300 detailed business processes, all developed in business process modeling notation across 7 different main processes. There's also more than 350 performance metrics across 8 different categories, and they include calculations of how these metrics should be performed. The SCOR DS Accelerator is available as an annual subscription service, and our objective is to continuously provide content updates throughout the life of the subscription. The SCOR DS Accelerator will really help you collaborate amongst your organization and manage all of the processes in a single place regarding your supply chain. The metrics provided by the SCOR DS Accelerator will help you align activity across your different organizational boundaries, as well as compare these metrics against industry standard benchmarks using the SCORmark data to measure supply chain performance. The SCOR DS Accelerator will focus on 2 of the primary areas that Jason mentioned earlier. The first is business process transformation, to help you capture not only the as-is state of all your business processes, but also the future or to-be state of how you would like your processes to be in the future. The second part is performance benchmarking. helping you to quantify the relative performance of your organization to similar supply chains and establish some internal targets and help set the strategy for how you'd like to proceed with your digital transformation using these performance metrics. The advantages of using the SCOR DS framework will enable you to focus on certain strategic activities. The first, as I mentioned, is documenting the as-is state of your processes, what you do and where. The second is developing that vision for future processes. Where do you want to be going forward? You can measure your supply chain performance to understand how you're doing, where you're trending. You can compare to industry performance benchmarks, looking at not only peers but also competitors. And then you can help to analyze and optimize your processes. How are you going to set that internal strategy around improvement targets and where you want to pursue certain areas of your supply chain transformation? And now I'd like to proceed by demonstrating the SCOR DS Accelerator powered by SAP Signavio. So let's head over to the platform itself so we can show you a little bit more in detail the content that's delivered through this accelerator itself. So let's begin by navigating over to the SCOR DS Accelerator on the SAP Signavio platform. Here we begin in the area called the Collaboration Hub, which lets you share information amongst all members of the organization about detailed processes in the framework itself. You'll notice that we begin with the infinity loop, as Jason mentioned earlier, that identifies all 7 primary processes of the SCOR DS framework. For today's demonstration, I'll go ahead and select one of these processes called Transform. We can actually navigate down through the SCOR DS hierarchy by selecting Transform. And we'll see we begin here by showing levels 2 and 3 of the Transform process itself. There are hundreds of processes identified within the framework. For today, we're actually going to go into detail a little bit more around Transform product. You'll see that each of the elements here has the framework number as identified by SCOR DS itself. And I can go ahead and select Transform product to navigate here down to level 3 and 4. The SCOR framework provides levels 1, 2, and 3 for the accelerator. And Visual Enterprise Architecture has gone ahead and added the additional content at level 4 for the SCOR DS framework. There are currently several hundred processes contained within the content subscription for the accelerator. All of this content has been developed based upon more than 20 years of best practices in supply chain and has been also peer-reviewed by more than a dozen members of ASCM as well. I'd like to navigate further and actually go down into one of these detailed processes. So I'll go ahead and select the process here called Perform Pre-Production Activities. You see here I can go ahead and select this particular process model. As mentioned earlier, all of the content within the SCOR DS framework is developed in BPMN, again, Business Process Modeling Notation. You'll see it includes a lot of detailed information, including starting, beginning, or beginning events and end events. You'll also notice detailed tasks and descriptions provided within each of the processes. In this particular process, this lane is notated by a particular role, or the shop floor associate. And each of these processes are also connected to each other by these beginning and ending events. At the end of this process, I can actually go ahead and select this event, which is called Line Ready for Production. If I select this event, I'll notice that it's actually tied to the subsequent process. This process is T1.4.2, performing production activities. Throughout each and every one of these processes, we continue to capture the role that's performing the activity, documents or data that may be passed amongst these activities, as well as some additional information. If I continue along this path and select the third process, recording work in progress data, you will notice that not only am I capturing information in this model around the events, roles, and activities, but also the different systems used to perform these activities. The SCOR DS Accelerator can be used in 3 different use cases. For those of you that are existing SAP customers, you can use this for your S4HANA digital transformation. You can also capture hybrid environments where you're using both SAP and additional systems that may not reside within SAP, as well as greenfield implementations of solutions that include SAP, include non-SAP, or may use other technologies to deliver capabilities around the supply chain. Let me actually navigate back up to the framework itself and show you how we can tie each of these individual processes together. I'd like to select another example. If I go ahead and select issue raw materials and components, I can begin to piece together the individual elements or processes from an end-to-end perspective, also known as a value-added chain. Here you'll recognize a few of the processes that we just visited in detail, 1.4.1 through 1.4.3. And this particular perspective gives us an indication of not only the processes that occur within the scope of the value chain, but also beginning and ending processes that are related to those we're currently looking at. The combination of the detailed processes and the ability to capture each and every process within your process portfolio, as well as understand the sequencing of how these processes or building blocks can be used together to build a complete picture of how your supply chain is currently operating. So not only does the Accelerator include the process framework and more than 300 detailed processes, but it also includes those performance metrics or benchmarks, the methods for calculating and understanding the performance of your organization's supply chain. I'm actually going to go ahead and navigate back up to the framework. You'll see here that I'm up at level 2 and 3 for transform and transform product. I'm going to select transform product, and here you'll see that we've actually gone ahead and included all of the metrics. There's more than 350 different metrics identified by the SCOR framework, and we've captured some of those here in an example. All of the metrics within the SCOR DS framework have actually been arranged into several different categories. Here you'll see we have some of those selected. Some of the most recent changes to those metrics include those within the ESG category itself. For a demonstration, I'm going to make a selection here on one of the reliability metrics, which is delivery performance to an original customer commit date. If I select this metric or indicator, there's two things that I'm going to see here. The first is a description of what this metric represents, as well as the categorization of this metric. You'll see here that it does belong to the reliability category. There's a metric ID. All the metrics within the SCOR DS have this metric ID for easy reference. But more importantly, what you'll see here is an understanding of the calculation of how this metric should be performed. In more than a decade of process mining as an organization, VEA has worked with organizations to capture the real data behind the operational performance of their processes. The inclusion of these calculations and how they're performed is really a valuable asset that you and your teams can use to ensure that you align to measurements based upon industry standard best practices. And with SCOR being the global standard for performance and best practices, definitely an excellent way to align your organization and your measurement of your organization to not only peers but also competitors. So the SCOR DS platform here within SAP Signavio not only provides these metrics, but also for those of you that like to understand how your real systems are performing, you can actually perform a process investigation. And here as an example, we have a visualization of this delivery performance. But we can also proceed to open the details around this investigation. If I open up this investigation, we'll see all of the different metrics that have been calculated for this particular investigation based upon SCOR DS. So what does this mean for you and your organization? This means that not only are you able to use an industry standard framework with SCOR DS, but capture metrics from your actual system using those industry standard calculations. For those of you that are corporate members of ASCM, they also deliver what's known as SCOR mark benchmarking data. This SCOR mark benchmarking data has been developed by more than 2,000 different supply chain organizations in the past 20 years and allows you to compare yourself based upon your specific performance to those industry standard benchmarks. All of these pieces combined, the process framework as well as the metrics framework, enables you to use the SCOR DS Accelerator to really drive your supply chain transformation. So Visual Enterprise Architecture and the Association for Supply Chain Management plan to continue to develop and release additional content around the SCOR DS Accelerator. We plan regular releases as part of this subscription content service. And I will leave you with a final view here of the SCOR DS framework. Again, SCOR DS really does provide an excellent foundation for you as an organization to manage your supply chain transformation. Now for some next steps. If you'd like to find out more about the SCOR DS Accelerator for your organization, you can use the SCOR DS Accelerator to leverage this supply chain global standard for excellence delivered by the Association for Supply Chain Management. And you can just contact VEA directly to find out more about our subscription pricing at SCOR DS at visualeabpm.com. You can also visit our site specifically online around the SCOR DS Accelerator and SAP Signavio at www.veabpi.com. Again, we appreciate your attention and participation today, and hopefully we can provide you with some support with the SCOR DS Accelerator in the near future.
Jason and Zach, terrific presentation on such an important topic. And I'm going to ask you to bring your cameras back on with me now for the questions that we have from our audience. There are questions posed here in the interface. There are questions that are posed on LinkedIn. We're trying to get to as many of those questions as possible. For either one of you, Zach and Jason, you may want to collaborate on this. First question has to do with governance, on process governance. What do you see as best practices? And just to contextualize a little bit, there are just multiple questions related to that. But like in my own experience as a leader for an energy organization, we had over 10,000 sub-processes in the organization because it's a quite complex organization. And then you know what we experience over time is that people start developing processes for things that maybe we should not even have a process for. And so there are different opinions about that, but in general, what do you see out there as perhaps best practices for structuring, for setting up governance for this type of process development?
That's a really great question. You know, there are a couple different pieces for governance. You know, managing a process portfolio requires a couple of different elements. Using a standardized framework or reference model is a great foundation, but for medium and large size portfolios and organizations, it's important to classify your processes so that people know exactly where those processes are as part of the portfolio. And the second is that governance piece. And governance really means ensuring that not only do you have processes documented, but that you facilitate process ownership. Ownership means that those people that are responsible for the processes have the right technology or solutions in place to review the content that's being developed. So using a platform such as the SCOR DS Accelerator and the technology such as SAP Signavio as a process excellence platform enables you to create that content, share and collaborate those processes amongst all of the organization, and ensure that the content has been reviewed and approved by the process owners. All these different pieces really work together to make sure that the content you're developing really drives value around your organization and how you manage or achieve process excellence.
I'm so glad you mentioned that for everybody, Zach. You know, the importance of process ownership and the broadest level of stewardship at the overall level for a program like this. And that's such an important, sometimes hidden item in successful deployments. Getting a little bit more tactical, there are a few questions related to deployment itself of the system. By the way, wonderful approach on getting to the high level process all the way to the sub process and ability to drill down further and further. what do you see as a typical training learning curve for people who are using not only the SCOR model, but the SAP Signavio interface that you share with us? What type of training is available? How do you roll that out in organizations?
Great question. You know, a typical implementation will take 6 or 8 weeks just to get the platform actually rolled out within the organization, to create materials that will drive adoption, one of the most important parts of being successful with enterprise process excellence. You know, building a foundation, you don't want all the members of the organization to build their own framework. Most of, especially around supply chain, using the SCOR DS standard is a great starting point. It helps to focus the energy and resources of the team around capturing the specific detailed processes of your organization and not creating a shared view, enterprise view that already exists. So using SCOR DS is a great starting point. And you know, the technology underlying SCOR DS, SAP Signavio, is really one of the premier platforms for managing process excellence and process content, and enables you to not only create a separation of duties between those that capture processes, whether it's workshops, facilitations, or transferring existing content materials around process, but also enabling and sharing that information amongst the enterprise. It really doesn't take that long to learn how to log into the collaboration hub and understand what each of these processes look like, especially in the context of using the SCOR DS framework.
The other thing I'll add as well, and in addition to what Zach mentioned, is ASCM also offers a 2-day SCOR DS training, which really focuses on digging into the details of the model itself. So not only the training on the application and the technological enablers, but also for those who just want to learn a little bit more about the model, that SCOR DS training is available through ASCM and our global partner network.
That's very helpful. That's very helpful. I want to go a little bit deeper on a little bit more detail on the interface training itself. So let's say a couple of days learning about the SCOR model itself and how it can be applied. Now, if I am getting to be a bit in the weeds, Zach, because some of the questions were a bit in the weeds, and I think that's important we get there. To learn the interface itself that you demonstrated to us. So let's say, you know, we agree that this is a process we need to document. We document the process. It has a couple of sub-processes associated with that. For someone who is a novice, who has never done this before, to get to the interface, learn about the basic structure, nomenclature, how to move it to, you know, items around to create a process and a sub-process. What kind of effort you're looking at? Are you talking about a few days, a few hours? How do you get people started at that level?
I think it really depends upon people's experience. In this day and age, most people have seen process models. They're familiar with, you know, BPMN. It used to be called, you know, swim lanes, a way of looking at different roles and separating activities and systems and documents, and how the sequence of those tasks can be laid in order to represent the actual process. So I think from that perspective, most people are familiar with that. And the great thing about navigating around the solution with SAP Signavio that we just showed you is that it's a web interface. Right, you just use a regular web browser and you can navigate not only through the different levels, but all the other information areas that provide more information about the processes. And depending upon your level of experience, it can be just a few hours to understand how to best utilize this capability. And if you wanted to find out a little bit more about modeling processes in detail, it could take a little bit of extra time.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Zach. We have time for one final question here, and this one's coming from Julia Mendelssohn specifically, and more related to the model itself and the industry benchmark data. She's asking, where does the benchmark data come from for those modules?
I think that's a question for Jason.
Yeah, so I'll take this one. So the SCORmark benchmark is what we call a submit to get model. So you get the results or the output from what you submit. So the industry data comes from all those companies that have submitted and done a SCORmark benchmark in the past, and it's delivered in conjunction with PwC. So PwC actually has all the back end data, the back end database that they compare against. So again, submit to get. And it's all those companies that have gone through and done the benchmark is how that population of data has been populated.
So a final question here that may be a solve world hunger type of question, but I'll ask anyway because we have the experts and I want to take advantage of that. Final one: what have we learned with the pandemic from the transformation modeling and supply chain specifically here that has been incorporated into new ways of thinking, or at a high level or maybe at a detail level? How has this model been impacted by the lessons of the pandemic?
Well, I've got a great line, Jason, and then I think I'll let you wrap this one up. My favorite line about how the pandemic has impacted the supply chain is, I think for 20 or 30 years, we've been focused on lean and efficiency. And what we've learned from the pandemic is we actually switched to the other side of that dial, which was resiliency, adaptability, and more than one way of doing things because of external factors and events, whether they're political or however they may impact your supply chain. Most organizations now are trying to fine tune that dial. Is it more towards efficiency or more towards resiliency, depending upon risk factors within your own internal organization? I know Jason can add a lot more around this as well.
Yeah, absolutely. The one thing I'll say is I'll summarize what Zach just said as I've heard it summarized as just in time has become just in case. So the idea now is supply chain being viewed as a strategic asset for an organization. And it's really all about how do we align our supply chain strategy and execution to our overall business strategy. I think that's been the key takeaway from all of the impacts of the pandemic, as well as geopolitical, et cetera, that have occurred over the past 2 years.
Ladies and gentlemen, it helps if I turn on my microphone when I speak. So Zach and Jason, I was saying that thank you for that great summary, a wonderful guide for all of us to think about effectiveness along with efficiency in our supply chains, and the component of risk management that you talked so well about. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and expertise of our global audience today. We have your contact information and the ways that we can get in touch with you. I encourage our audience to follow up with that contact information that was provided during the video, but also connect with Jason and Zach through LinkedIn. We have the LinkedIn post up on and you can see their direct connection information through that link that was provided to you in the chat. Zach again, Jason again, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and expertise with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. That was Zach Bennett, CEO and Chief Architect for Visual Enterprise Architecture, and Jason Robke, who is a Senior Manager for Alliances Development of the Association for Supply Chain Management. Thank you again, Jason and Zach, for sharing your wisdom and expertise with us. We're going to be taking a break now, and when we come back, we're going to bring another cross-industry expert of supply chain leadership, planning, and management. And I'm talking about Jack Ampuya, who is the president for the Supply Chain Optimizers. And Jack is going to be sharing his perspective on the value of packaging optimization on supply chains. So a true world expert in this area, sharing his wisdom and expertise with us. So please take a break now and log back on at the top of the hour for Jack Ampuya's presentation. Thank you.